Captain Mara Reyes stood alone in the empty briefing room, eyes fixed on the sealed envelope marked "Ease Only." Her unit had turned their backs on her after the failed op in Karachi, after manipulated schematics, blindsided her team, and left her carrying the blame. What they didn't know was this: she'd intercepted the real mission file's evidence of a threat that reached far beyond her own reputation. As she broke the seal, her hands remained steady. Protocols were clear, but so was the risk to national security if she stayed silent. The next 72 hours would test everything she knew about trust and consequence. The Karachi mission had not unraveled due to bad luck or sloppy planning. Reyes replayed the breach in her mind. Her team moved in, perimeter checked, thermal scans showing nothing out of place. Then, in a single, jarring instant, Sergeant Vance's comms went dead, the northeast wall erupted inward, and hostile fire poured from vantage points no one had expected. In less than 6 minutes, chaos overtook the plan. 2 operators were down, extraction was a scramble, and the enemy melted away before backup could even mobilize. 3 days later, the fallout was everywhere. In the mess hall, conversations dropped to a hush when Reyes entered. The medic who'd stitched her up after the blast now avoided her gaze. At the morning briefing, Major Cho reassigned her to desk duty, the words clipped and final. "Temporary measure," he said, but the paperwork told a different story. No timeline, no review date, just a quiet removal from the field. The details gnawed at her. Satellite images from the operation looped in her mind, especially the muzzle flashes she'd glimpsed from a 3rd-story window in Building 7. A building recon had marked as empty. She spent hours comparing after-action reports to the city's urban survey maps, searching for answers. That's when she found it. The blueprints used for the 900 briefing didn't match those at 1100. Subtle differences, a wall added. A staircase omitted enough to create blind spots. Someone had deliberately altered the schematics, setting her team up for disaster. Late at night, alone in the intelligence office, Reyes dug deeper. She pulled the comm logs investigators had dismissed, looking for patterns. The jamming wasn't random. It targeted Vance's squad and followed a rhythm too precise for local insurgents. Cross-referencing the altered blueprints with the comms blackout, she saw the alignment. The interference began just as her team moved into the kill zone. Buried in the mission packet's metadata, she almost missed it, a small encrypted file labeled TAC-SUP. That code hadn't been used by her unit in 4 years. The system didn't decrypt it automatically. She had to force it open, bypassing standard protocols. Inside were 23 pages of operational details that matched no mission on record. Names, coordinates, and extraction points for an operation that didn't officially exist. At the end, a single line, "Package delivery confirmed." She checked the security logs and found the file had been attached using Major Cho's credentials, just 14 minutes before the Karachi briefing. But Cho hadn't even been in the building that morning. The implications were immediate: someone with high-level access had tampered with their mission data, using outdated encryption to hide their tracks. Reyes printed the files and locked them away, her mind racing through every detail. The evidence pointed to sabotage, not error. As she prepared to leave, she glanced at the clock. If she wanted to find out who was behind this, she'd have to move before her access was revoked. The building was quiet, the night shift just beginning to settle in. Reyes turned her attention to the digital paper trail, launching her own silent investigation. She started with the mission reports from the last 6 months, searching for patterns that might explain the string of failed operations. The anomalies emerged quickly. Each compromised mission showed last-minute changes, altered blueprints, shifted radio frequencies, equipment swaps always logged within 90 minutes of execution. The modifications all originated from Terminal 412, an access point reserved for just 7 senior intelligence staff. The suspect pool was small, and she was in it. She cross-referenced the personnel files against the system logs, watching the same names surface again and again. Major Cho's credentials appeared a handful of times, but Lieutenant Hale's name was on every failed operation. It wasn't just the frequency of his involvement, it was the consistency. Hale had processed each mission package that went sideways. Knowing she needed technical expertise, Reyes reached out to Petty Officer Riverton. They met in the parking lot, engine off, windows fogged. She passed him a stack of comm logs and blueprints. Riverton flipped through the files, his face unreadable in the dim light. "These ECM patterns are military-grade directional jamming," he said, his voice flat. That was all she needed to hear. She took the files back, understanding the risk she'd just asked him to take. The next step was to compare failed missions to those that had succeeded. She noticed a critical detail. Every successful op used Lockhart transponders, while the compromised ones relied on older TR-7 models. Hale had signed off on all the equipment manifests. The TR-7s, she remembered, were vulnerable to specific jamming frequencies, a vulnerability only someone with a background in electronic warfare would know to exploit. Hale's service record confirmed it. 4 years in Signal Corps before he moved to intelligence. As she pored over the upcoming Wolverine exercise, the pattern sharpened. Hale had assigned the same compromised transponders to Echo Company, her former squad. The operations parameters mirrored Karachi urban insertion, high-value target, narrow window. The blueprints for the Estonian factory, logged under Hale's credentials, showed fresh structural modifications. Reyes checked the personnel tracker. Hale had filed for emergency leave 3 hours ago, booked on a flight to Helsinki departing soon. She dug into Hale's financials and saw 3 large offshore deposits, the latest time-stamped just after the Estonia blueprints were filed. The payment note read, "Final delivery confirmed for package WR-47. Wolverine was set to launch in 36 hours. Echo Company was about to walk into the same trap." Reyes closed every file, wiped her terminal's history, and watched as the system logged her out. Her access was gone. She stepped into the corridor, the blueprints pressed tight against her ribs, and moved toward the side exit. The air outside was thick with diesel and damp concrete. Security officers were checking badges at the main entrance, but she didn't look back. Her investigation was no longer secret, and she knew the window for action was closing fast. Reyes faced the new reality of being cut off from every official support system. The base's digital gatekeeper denied her login, and the 2 Marines by the intelligence office door left no room for negotiation. She tried the backup terminal. Riverton had once shown her, but the result was the same clearance revoked, a terse notice spitting out accusations she recognized as false. Her access to information, colleagues, and even physical spaces was now tightly controlled. Back in her quarters, she recognized the subtle aftermath of a search. The locker's edge sat slightly ajar, and her field jacket had been handled, but the hollow beneath the floor panel where she'd hidden the Estonia files remained untouched. Whoever had gone through her belongings had worked with practiced care, missing the one detail that mattered. Reyes took in the scene, cataloguing the evidence of intrusion, but knowing it would do her no good now. Major Cho's summons came at 1,400. The atmosphere in his office was thick, not with the scent of polish, but with the tension in the air. He barely looked up from her personnel file, his thumb twitching against his knee as she spoke. "You're wasting resources chasing ghosts," he said, voice clipped. When Reyes pressed about the jamming patterns and requested maintenance logs, Cho's response was too practiced, his impatience breaking through in the subtle pulse of a vein at his collar. The conversation ended with a warning disguised as advice. She left with nothing, no support, no promise of review, only the certainty that her investigation was now under suspicion. Riverton's last message arrived in code, buried in a late-night weather report over shortwave. She tuned the battered receiver, catching the phrase that told her Hale's flight had routed through Stockholm. Her reply, a gum wrapper left in a known spot, was the only way she could confirm receipt. Their communication had become a series of small risks, each step more exposed than the last. It didn't take long for the surveillance to become overt. A white sedan with military plates lingered by the commissary parking lot, the driver's mirrored sunglasses fixed on Building D. During her afternoon runs, a woman in civilian clothes shadowed her, matching pace with unnatural precision. When Reyes altered her route, the monitoring adapted. Email drafts appeared in her inbox messages she hadn't written. Security cameras tracked her more intently, their programmed sweeps suddenly attentive to her movements. She reverted to fieldcraft learned years ago. Her schedule shifted unpredictably. She left messages in dead drops, a folded receipt behind a ceiling tile, a coffee stain marking a book page. Each exchange was checked for tampering, each face in the corridor memorized. The sense of being watched grew heavier. Trust became a liability. On Friday, the pattern sharpened. Patrol logs revealed that Hale's apartment had been searched again, this time after his departure and after her own investigation had come to light. The search team inventoried devices already checked weeks earlier, a sign they were looking for something new, likely her involvement. That afternoon, Riverton disappeared from contact. His usual check-ins ceased, and her latest dead drop remained untouched, except for the faint trace of another's hand. Isolation settled in. Reyes understood that her actions were now mapped and anticipated, her connections methodically severed. With every channel compromised, she sat on her bunk, the locked door, a silent reminder that the rules had shifted. She needed a new approach that would force her adversaries to reveal themselves before Echo Company walked into disaster. She staged chaos to draw surveillance off her real hunt. In public, Reyes appeared increasingly erratic, searching for the wrong files, dropping cryptic notes, and picking loud arguments about invented discrepancies. It was all designed to pull attention away from her actual movements and feed the idea that she was unraveling under pressure. The real operation began with a USB drive left behind in the recreation center. It looked like a desperate mistake, but Reyes had spent weeks preparing it. The files were labeled Karachi Truth, and the passphrase protection would trigger a data wipe after 3 failed attempts. What no one else knew was that the decoy files carried a payload tracking malware she'd reverse-engineered 4 years earlier from insurgent code, drawing on her background in electronic warfare. The program would quietly log every access point and relay the data to a dead-drop server she monitored from an unregistered tablet. Within 18 hours, the trap was sprung. The malware reported 3 separate access attempts from terminals in Building C. 2 belonged to security staff, but the third, more interesting, was traced to Lieutenant Coulson in communications, a name that hadn't surfaced in her earlier investigation. Minutes after trying to crack the USB, Coulson's credentials accessed Hale's travel files. Reyes snapped photos of every timestamp and network path with a burner camera, careful to document without leaving a digital footprint. The pattern grew more complex. All access attempts stopped at 1,942 hours, coinciding with an unscheduled server maintenance window authorized by Major Cho. Reyes suspected this was a cover for purging evidence. She needed to confirm Cho's role, so at 400 she slipped into the motor pool office and checked vehicle dispatch records. Cho's staff car had logged 3 late-night trips to a private airfield, each aligning with encrypted file transfers in the system logs. She photographed the evidence, then left the login screen, showing corrupted credentials final flourish, to reinforce her supposed instability. The malware's last report was the most revealing. One compromised terminal initiated a VPN connection to a server in Estonia, its IP address linked to a telecommunications hub near the abandoned factory from the Wolverine briefing. This confirmed the mole network was actively preparing the next operation. With official channels compromised and even Riverton unreachable, Reyes knew she could no longer rely on anyone inside the base. She documented her findings in a falsified investigation log, deliberately sloppy and riddled with paranoid speculation. The last entry accused Riverton of betrayal, the ink smudged with water to mimic tears. She left the base with only the Estonia files and the camera. Her Phonia prepaid burner became her sole link to the outside world. She drove to a storage unit under her sister's name, swapped uniforms for civilian clothes, and replaced her plates. At 2,200, she sent a coded message to an old special operations contact. The reply arrived 40 minutes later, coordinates, a name, and a place to disappear. As she drove north, leaving the city lights behind, Reyes watched the road for tails and kept the evidence close. She didn't know what she'd find at the end of the drive, only that it would be far from the reach of anyone still watching. The fishing cabin sat at the edge of the village, its paint long faded by salt wind. Inside, everything served a purpose. Reyes moved quietly, checking for tripwires and loose boards before settling in. Master Chief Boyd had left a battered ammo crate under the porch with just enough to get started: an old field radio, regional maps, and a sidearm. The slip of paper inside the pistol grip 460 on the dial was a familiar code, a silent assurance that the safe house protocols still held. She established her routine quickly. All communications ran through Boyd's call signs from Somalia, with verification phrases only someone from their old team would know. The radio, slow to warm, was set to transmit in brief windows when atmospheric noise masked signals. Reyes never lingered on the air. She used the cassette recorder to capture shortwave traffic, then played it back at half speed to catch embedded codes. Her messages relied on weather reports, a trick from years spent dodging surveillance in less forgiving places. The Estonia files covered the table, each page marked with notes and cross-references. Reyes matched Hale's travel records to the factory blueprints and found something that didn't fit: a drainage tunnel listed as collapsed on official maps, but recently active according to thermal scans. Every night, 2 heat signatures appeared at the tunnel entrance. The pattern was too regular to be coincidence. A coded report came through the radio, confirming what she suspected. The analyst on the other end relayed news of expanded operations, new compromised officers, more moving parts. The message was buried in static, but the numbers matched pages in Boyd's fishing almanac. She found a map of the Tallinn coast, marked with a series of crosses. Each one lined up with the Wolverine exercise schedule and matched the timing of Hale's offshore deposits. The implication was clear. A weapons shipment would arrive by trawler, slipping in during gaps in maritime patrols. Midway through her checks, the radio crackled with an unscheduled messenger clipped voice, reciting fishing quotas, and then a single set of coordinates. Reyes traced the numbers to a decommissioned Soviet radar station near the factory. She took apart the radio and found a strip of microfilm hidden inside a vacuum tube. The magnified text revealed orders for a second operation in Lithuania, set to mirror the Estonian plan. Both would use compromised transponders, pushing NATO units into pre-planned kill zones. She documented the details quickly. The Baltic operation wasn't an isolated breach, it was a coordinated effort to strike multiple battalions under the cover of routine exercises. Reyes switched to pencil and waterproof paper when the recorder's battery failed, sketching out timelines and unit movements. The method was simple: isolate, jam, ambush, and delay response long enough to inflict maximum damage. Before sunrise, she checked the snowmobile in the woodshed. The tank was half full, enough to reach the border if she moved carefully. Reyes concealed the evidence beneath a floorboard, keeping only what she could carry. She paused at the door, listening for movement outside, then stepped into the cold. The clock was running. With less than 2 days left, she would need every minute to warn Echo Company and stop the operation from unfolding as planned. The snowmobile's engine cooled in the darkness as Reyes approached the forestry station. She checked the fuel gauge, almost empty, and moved quickly inside, careful to keep her silhouette low against the frosted window. 37 hours remained until Wolverine's scheduled insertion. The emergency landline still hummed with a dial tone, but she knew any standard call would light up the network's monitoring systems. She ignored the faded evacuation map and focused on the wiring behind the phone. In the shadowed quiet, she stripped 2 wires with her multi-tool, tapping out a crude pulse dialer. The connection bypassed the usual switchboards, landing her on a backup line in the motor pool. 3 rings. Corporal Dennis picked up, his voice wary. Reyes spoke in code, referencing a vehicle inspection from their first deployment. Dennis answered with the correct countersign, confirming the line was secure. She kept her instructions brief. He needed to access the battalion's secure Dropboxer digital dead letter system meant for emergencies. "File labeled Blackbird Migration Charts," she said. "Password is our shared birthday, backwards." Dennis hesitated, understanding the risk. If caught, both would face immediate court-martial. He exhaled, then agreed. The call ended with a click. Dawn brought a pale blue light over Camp Vimsey. Reyes watched from a ridge, binoculars pressed to her face. The base perimeter bristled with unusual activity, extra sniper teams on the western flank, supply trucks arriving at precise intervals. Everything matched the schedule she'd reconstructed from Hale's notes. The operation was moving forward exactly as the trap required. Her stolen laptop pinged just after 9:30. Denny's had uploaded the Dropbox file. Inside, she found last-minute changes to Echo Company's extraction plan, rerouting their rally point to the shadow of Building 7. She cross-referenced the coordinates with thermal images from her Baltic contacts. The new rally point sat directly in line with the same structural weaknesses exploited in Karachi blind spots that would funnel the company into pre-planned kill zones. As confirmed by the after-action analysis of the Karachi ambush, the pattern was unmistakable. Reyes tracked the patrol rotations, noting that Lieutenant Coulson would supervise comms checks at 1,300. That gave her a narrow window. She smeared dirt on her face, changed into fatigues, swiped from a laundry delivery, and clipped on a forged badge. The disguise wouldn't stand up to close inspection, but it might buy her enough time. She moved through a drainage ditch parallel to the motor pool, the stench of diesel and rot masking her approach. At 1,257, the guards shifted position as expected, their attention fixed on the command tent. Inside the camp, she kept to the shadows, moving between supply crates marked for Estonia. The serial numbers matched fraudulent manifests from Hale's files. She passed a private who nodded without suspicion, her uniform and steady stride making her blend in. At the command tent, she paused, listening to Colonel Vartan's voice, a clipped, Georgian accent, discussing insertion timelines. The radio crackled at 1,301. Coulson's status update. Reyes steadied herself, adjusted the clipboard, and stepped through the tent flap. Vartan looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes before his expression hardened. Two aides moved for their sidearms. The tent fell silent, except for the radio's static. Reyes kept her voice level. "Sir, you're about to walk into a carbon copy of Karachi. The extraction point is pre-targeted. I have proof." She set the laptop on the table, screen open to the thermal overlays and ambush positions. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable. Outside, the camp's routine continued, boots on gravel, radios chirping, patrols shifting. Inside, the tension pressed in, the seconds stretching as Vartan weighed her words. Reyes stood her ground, waiting for a decision, knowing that what happened next would determine more than the fate of a single operation. Protocol demanded silence, but Reyes moved anyway. She kept low, slipping between the shipping containers as the staging area's floodlights cut through the darkness. She waited out 3 rotations, counting the seconds between each guard's pass. When the perimeter cleared, she found the maintenance hatch just where Riverton's schematics had promised. The crawl space beneath the comms trailer stank of mildew and old wiring, but it brought her within reach of the command server's own chance to alter the record. Inside the cramped space, she bypassed the technical ritual and focused on the outcome. Reyes filtered the encrypted traffic for Hale's identifiers, isolating 3 data bursts that rerouted Echo Company's medevac plans. Each change mirrored the fatal blueprint of Karachi. Extraction sent to blind spots, satellite coverage absent, every route a trap. She injected evidence that pointed directly to Hale after-action reports and thermal images, all logged under his credentials, all impossible to ignore. The audit trail would implicate him even in his absence, forcing the system to confront what had been buried. She erased her digital footprints, then eased back into the cold air, nerves tight. A flashlight swept the gravel near the trailer. Reyes pressed herself against the shadows, heart steady, until the light moved on. She emerged only when the risk had passed, boots crunching softly on frost. 6 feet away, a figure stood with a service pistol low at his side. The name tag read Vega, face she hadn't seen since Karachi. He didn't raise his weapon, just watched her, the memory of that night hanging between them. There had been a moment in Karachi, pinned under fire, when Vega had dragged 2 wounded out through a side door Reyes found on a faulty schematic. They'd both lost people there. The silence stretched, then Vega's eyes narrowed in recognition. "You saw the Blue Jay reports," Reyes said quietly, naming the file that had haunted both their careers. Vega's stance shifted, the tension in his shoulders easing as he realized she was not the enemy. They ducked behind a generator noise covering their words. Vega admitted he'd tried to report the same pattern in the Estonia mission. His concerns were dismissed, flagged as redundant. The frustration in his voice was raw, the kind that came from watching the system fail the people it was meant to protect. Reyes showed him the altered files on her tablet. Together they traced the sabotage to Coulson's credentials, the timestamps matching his supposed medical leave. Vega's jaw set. They didn't need to say what it meant. At 347, they made a plan. Vega would file an official report about suspicious server activity, triggering a mandatory review without directly naming names. Reyes handed him a microdrive, disguised as a maintenance log evidence that could not be ignored. Vega tucked it away, his nod brief but resolute as the morning patrol rounded the corner. They slipped back into their roles, offering a routine explanation about antenna checks to the passing NCO. Reyes disappeared into the pre-dawn shadows, the cold biting through her jacket as she circled the perimeter. She retrieved her backup drive from its hiding place, every file ready in case she needed to run. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, as the first shift whistles sounded across the base. The system would be forced to act now, whether out of self-preservation or genuine alarm. In the distance, the command tent's lights burned through the grey, and Reyes kept moving, certain that the next hours would reveal just how deep the breach went. From her vantage point in the water tower, Reyes watched as the trap she had set began to close. The base below moved with an orchestrated calm, but she could see the subtle shift security teams adjusting their routes, command vehicles repositioning, the tempo of radio traffic spiking in short, controlled bursts. Colonel Vartan, after reviewing the evidence Reyes had provided, issued a quiet stand-down for Wolverine's original launch. On the surface, it looked like a pause for equipment checks, but the real work was already in motion. Within the hour, counterintelligence teams moved in. Lieutenant Coulson, caught in the act of purging files from the comms server, was pulled from his post. The attempt to erase evidence was enough to confirm suspicions. Coulson's resistance didn't last long. Under questioning, he admitted to altering mission parameters on Hale's orders. The confession, though expected, sent a ripple through the command structure. Reyes tracked the commotion through her binoculars, noting the deliberate Pacino alarms, no raised voices, just a tightening net. A black sedan made a sudden dash for the main gate, its urgency out of place in the otherwise measured response. Security intercepted the vehicle before it could reach the highway, discovering a hard drive containing classified schematics and after-action reports. The escape attempt was textbook, a panicked move by someone realizing the net had closed. Everything about the operation's choreography, false starts, controlled leaks, monitored communications had led to this moment, exposing the mole's desperation and confirming the counterintelligence team's planning. As dusk settled, the revised Wolverine operation launched. Echo Company, now fully briefed and equipped with secure transponders, advanced along alternate routes. Reyes listened in on the radio circuits she'd tapped, hearing the difference in tone measured, alert, ready for contact. The enemy, expecting a vulnerable target, instead found themselves encircled. NATO forces moved with precision, flanking ambush teams that had been positioned using the same blueprint manipulations that doomed Karachi. Intercepted enemy transmissions crackled with confusion and frustration, revealing that their inside source had fed them details that no longer matched reality. The final confirmation arrived late in the night. A Latvian signals team intercepted an encrypted burst from the factory basement. The decoded message was more than tactical chatter. It contained a roster of compromised personnel across several NATO commands. The scale of the breach was suddenly clear. This was not a single operation sabotaged, but a network exposed. Reyes documented every detail, photographing timestamps, authentication codes, and the faces of Echo Company as they secured the site without casualties. Among the prisoners were two enemy operatives, both wounded, both potential links to higher-level handlers. The radio brought word that Lithuanian forces had simultaneously raided the secondary target, uncovering identical sabotage-modified blueprints, compromised transponders, ambush teams using Hale's patterns. When the helicopters finally lifted Echo Company out, Reyes left her post as quietly as she'd arrived. She wiped down every surface she'd touched, pocketed her spent brass, and walked the long route back to her temporary shelter. In the dark, she let herself consider what the night had cost: lives preserved, yes, but reputations and careers left in the balance. Just before dawn, a coded message confirmed that 3 more moles had been apprehended, each holding positions of trust, but never enough to draw attention. The message carried an instruction. Reyes was to report for debrief at a remote grid coordinate before sunrise. She burned her remaining notes, watching the flames consume months of work. The last of her evidence warped in the heat, rendered useless to anyone but those who already knew the truth. In the pale morning light, Reyes checked her weapon, then set out for the rendezvous. 2 Humvees waited, engines idling, the officers inside ready to escort her back to base. As they drove, the base's routines resumed: guards at their posts, vehicles moving in practiced patterns, the outward appearance unchanged. Yet Reyes knew everything had shifted. The proof was locked away, but vindication was never simple. She watched the base come into view, aware that her next steps would unfold in a world forever altered by the night's revelations. The envelope slid across the table, thick with photos. Hale seated in an airport holding cell, 3 passports stacked on the counter, a ledger of offshore accounts laid bare. The colonel's question came before any introductions. "How long did you know about the Lithuanian operation?" The room felt airless, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Reyes answered with what she had: coordinates, altered blueprints, the relay at the Soviet radar station. She watched the older officer's eyes flick to the analyst, who stopped typing just long enough to check her details against the file in her lap. They released her with new credentials and instructions to report each morning. The base moved differently now: extra patrols around the comms hub, officers passing with document pouches locked tight, conversations clipped and careful. In the hallway, a captain from Karachi deployment paused by the water fountain. "Sierra, November protocols worked," he said quietly, before moving on. It took 2 days for Sergeant Vance to find her in the mess hall. He sat across from her, pushing a tray of food forward. No apology, just a dog tag pressed into her palm: a Lithuanian unit, the edges worn smooth. "You kept us in the fight," he said, voice low. For a moment, the noise of the room faded, replaced by the memory of concrete dust and radio static. The gesture said what words couldn't. The rest of her former squad kept their distance, but the message was clear enough. The story had shifted. The investigation summary arrived by courier. 17 moles identified, 4 weapons shipments seized, millions traced to shell accounts. Tucked inside, a memo offered her a position with the new Counterintelligence Task Force CCC clearance, direct reporting, no field deployment. Reyes left the offer on her desk and stepped out as dusk settled over the runway. Medevac helicopters landed in a line, rotors slowing as soldiers disembarked. She recognized the way they moved: shoulders set, eyes scanning, alive in a way that betrayed their relief. Later, Colonel Vartan called her in. His office was spare, 2 chairs, a Baltic map studded with colored pins. He pointed to a cluster near the Lithuanian border. "We think there's a second network," he said, sliding a folder across. Inside were reports from junior officers' anomalies in equipment logs, patrol routes, credentials used at odd hours. Small details, but Reyes saw the pattern forming. Vartan poured coffee, the carafe chipped at the rim. "The offer stands," he said, nodding at the Pentagon memo. "But I'd understand if you're done digging through other people's lies." She turned the dog tag over in her hand, feeling the familiar weight. The folder in front of her was thin, but it carried the same gravity as a loaded sidearm. Outside, a formation jogged past, boots striking pavement in rhythm. She took the folder, knowing the work wasn't finished. The next morning, as she reviewed new security protocols and scanned the day's reports, A plain envelope was slipped under her door. She recognized the medal immediately, gunmetal grey, unmarked, weighty in the hand. Its surface bore only faint striations, a deliberate absence of any official insignia. The note accompanying it was brief, written in block print, for seeing what others refused to. The phrase echoed what she'd once heard, whispered in a closed-door meeting. Admiral Chen's words, spoken without witnesses, meant for those who had acted when protocol demanded silence. The medal itself was a contradiction, a commendation that could never be displayed, a symbol of service that required secrecy. The ceremony was as spare as the medal. A staff car collected her before dawn, taking a circuitous route to a hangar on the edge of base. Admiral Whitcomb met her at the threshold, offered a quiet nod, then pinned the medal inside her uniform jacket, fastening it against her skin. "Wear it where only you'll know," he said, his voice low. There were no photographs, no citations, no mention in her file. The gesture was the Navy's way of acknowledging what it could not admit. Some acts of service would remain invisible, some debts never publicly paid. Back in her quarters, she examined the medal's construction. The pin's catch had been filed smooth, its edges rounded to avoid detection. She pressed it flat against her collarbone and felt its steady weight as she reviewed the roster for the Baltic Task Force. 7 names stood out, each already flagged in the aftermath of her investigation, each now under discreet surveillance. The medal became a private anchor, a physical reminder that the work was not finished, even as the official channels slowed her every request. Over time, she learned the medal's origin. A logistics officer, passing her a stack of manifests, paused at the wax seal. "Joint Chief's Commendation," he murmured, eyes never leaving the paperwork. 12 minted, if that. The number matched the rumor. A small circle of recipients, each marked by actions that could never be made public. The connection was subtle, another silent confirmation that her choices had not gone unnoticed. The medal became part of her routine. Each morning she checked its position, ensuring it left no trace beneath her uniform. Before briefings, she pressed it through her Jaquita quiet ritual. At a security conference, Admiral Chen's aide brushed her shoulder and nodded once, a gesture loaded with meaning. The medal's weight was a reminder of what she'd risked and what she'd protected. The significance of the medal grew during private debriefs. Intelligence officers brought her new surveillance photos, encrypted communications, and evidence of infiltration that mirrored the patterns she'd exposed. When she identified a fresh breach, this time exploiting medical supply inventories, the lead investigator handed her a folder. Inside, production records for another set of unmarked medals, each linked to a compromised operation. The pattern was clear. Recognition came quietly, and always with a cost. Months later, she stood at a public ceremony, a standard commendation pinned to her dress uniform as cameras flashed. The hidden medal pressed cold against her ribs beneath the fabric, unseen but never forgotten. Admiral Chen paused beside her, voice barely above a whisper. The others know. He didn't elaborate. The meaning was understood. She noticed the first scratch on the medal's surface that night, a thin mark, evidence of wear, and a reminder that even hidden honors carried scars. The medal's presence was both a comfort and a burden, a tangible record of sacrifices that would never be entered into any official history. The next morning, as she prepared for another day of work, the medal's weight reminded her that some battles did not end with a ceremony. There were always new patterns to spot, new threats to track, and new officers who would look to her for guidance. The routine resumed, but the work had changed. Reyes stepped into the counterintelligence office, noting the faint scent of new paint beneath the hum of overhead lights. Her return came with conditions: field access, direct reporting, and the authority to redesign how mission anomalies were reviewed. The approval arrived faster than she expected. The first reform was the Karachi Checksar 12-point verification process, born from the original TR-7 radio exploit. In the months since its adoption, the protocol flagged 3 sabotage attempts and prevented losses that would have numbered in the thousands. She posted the updated checklist above the operations board, a quiet reminder of what vigilance could accomplish. It didn't take long for the new culture to show itself. A young lieutenant appeared in her doorway one morning, holding a printout of a maintenance request that didn't match any scheduled work. He hesitated, then explained he'd noticed a pattern requests filed just before shift changes, always on equipment with no reported faults. Reyes listened, asked for supporting documentation, and added his findings to her matrix of irregularities. The moment lingered with her. Officers now brought concerns forward without fear of dismissal, and the act of speaking up became routine rather than exception. The headlines about the mole network faded quickly, but the real work went on in quieter corners. Official reports listed arrests and resignations, but Reyes tracked the gaps, offshore accounts, rerouted shipments, and procurement anomalies that pointed to actors still at large. She filed her findings anyway, knowing some would vanish into archives, but the record mattered. Each thread she followed added to a broader understanding of how oversight had failed and how it could be rebuilt. Reyes found her greatest leverage in the training rotations. Every 2 weeks, she ran field exercises based on the failures she'd once misaltered blueprints, compromised frequencies, subtle changes in structural load. The lessons were blunt. Trainees learned by making mistakes, and every scenario ended with a debrief that pulled no punches. When a lieutenant realized he'd overlooked a sign of tampered equipment, Reyes quietly salvaged his discarded report, later using it as a teaching case for the next group. The cycle of learning and correction became the backbone of her reform efforts. The briefing room itself felt unchanged, but the atmosphere had shifted. The first time Reyes returned, she paused at the threshold, listening to the familiar whir of the projector. Now, when she spoke, the room stilled not from skepticism, but from respect earned by accuracy. She no longer needed notes. The details lived in memory, and her hand sometimes found the hidden medal beneath her collar in moments of decision. The weight was constant, a private reminder of the cost of vigilance. One afternoon, a systems analyst from the Lithuania case approached her after a joint briefing. He spoke quietly, mentioning a new anomaly in South China Sea deployments patterns that didn't fit old sabotage signatures. Reyes requested unfiltered data, knowing the value of raw details before automated systems could erase nuance. The files arrived with a single note: "Thought you'd want this before it's cleaned." Her office whiteboard filled with new markers red for confirmed, blue for possible, black for the uncertain. The spread of colors mapped the growing complexity of the threat landscape. Vartan stopped by one evening, studying the board in silence before observing, "They've adapted." Reyes nodded. The adversary had changed, but so had their response. Before leaving each night, she updated the Karachi checks, now 15 items long. The latest edition required verifying electronics maintenance logs against physical inspections. Some grumbled at the extra work, but when Foxtrot Company caught tampered transponders during a routine check, the incident report noted, "Item 12 found it." Her reputation became a quiet refrain in planning meetings: get Reyes to look at it, run the anomaly protocols. She used the attention judiciously, waiting for the right moment to demonstrate vulnerabilities to procurement, leading to swift reform orders from above. The medal's presence was a silent compass, guiding her through decisions that would have once been solitary burdens. As the next cycle of recruits assembled in the auditorium, Reyes reviewed her notes for the upcoming address. She understood that the work of reform depended on more than protocols and checklists. The real test would come in how the next generation learned to see and act when the pattern didn't fit. Rows of recruits sat in the auditorium, backs straight and eyes forward, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Reyes stepped up to the lectern, her uniform crisp insignia catching the light. She didn't pause to collect her thoughts. Her presence was enough. There was no need to recount her record. Everyone in the room already knew the story, whether from whispers or official briefings. She opened with a question: "How many of you checked your gear twice before you came here today?" Hands rose, some hesitant, others quick. A few exchanged glances. Reyes nodded, acknowledging the ripple of self-awareness moving through the group. She explained that habit was less about paranoia, more about respect for the process and the people who depended on it. Her instruction was direct. She outlined the importance of confirming orders, logging discrepancies, and never assuming that routine meant safe. She didn't use anecdotes or dramatics. Instead, She described how a single unchecked frequency or a minor change in a manifest could cascade into disaster. The recruits listened, some leaning forward, others scribbling notes. When she mentioned the subtle ways sabotage could hide in plain sight, a signature slightly off, a timestamp that didn't fit the room grew more attentive. Vigilance is a discipline, she said, her voice steady. It's not suspicion for its own sake. It's knowing that systems fail, and that your duty is to notice when something doesn't add up. She referenced a line from the regulations paragraph 14-2, reminding them that every irregularity, no matter how small, must be reported. The words sounded dry, but the silence that followed made clear they understood the implication. She took a single question from the floor. A corporal near the exit stood, voice tight. What if your report gets misplaced? The auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Reyes answered without hesitation. Then you follow up. You document every attempt. You don't let silence be the end of it. She didn't promise the system would always respond, nor did she soften the reality that sometimes persistence was the only safeguard. After dismissal, most recruits filed out quickly, their conversations subdued. One private lingered, waiting until the room had emptied before approaching the stage. She introduced herself as Draper, her posture regulation perfect, but her hands betraying a nervous rhythm. Draper produced an operations order, the paper folded and creased from repeated handling. Reyes took it, unfolding the document and smoothing it flat. The coordinates were standard, but in the margins, someone had made handwritten adjustments. Timing shifted, approach angles altered. The handwriting matched a style Reyes recognized, careful and deliberate, a detail that would mean little to most, but caught her attention immediately. Who signed off on these changes? Reyes asked, keeping her tone neutral. Draper hesitated. The officer listed as approving has been on leave for weeks. I checked. Her voice was low, uncertain, but determined. Reyes examined the initials, noting the familiar slant and the distinctive loop details she had learned to recognize the hard way. She didn't offer reassurances or dismiss Draper's concern. Instead, she logged the report, noting every timestamp and witness. She handed Draper a copy. Keep this safe, she advised, her tone practical, not fearful. At the door, Draper paused. Am I overreacting? Reyes shook her head. You're doing your job. As the lights dimmed and the last voices faded, Reyes watched Draper disappear into the corridor. The lesson was clear enough. Some acts of vigilance would never be seen by a crowd, and some lessons didn't require visibility to matter. In the quiet that followed, Reyes gathered the paperwork, preparing for what came next. Reyes set Draper's annotated operations order beside the rest of her case files, the familiar slant of the handwriting catching her eye. She didn't need to trace every loop of the altered coordinates to recognize the pattern's subtle shifts, just enough to slip past routine checks unless someone was looking for them. The method matched the sabotage she'd seen before. Draper, still standing at attention, waited for instruction. Reyes motioned her closer and asked her to point out the first thing she'd noticed. The timestamp discrepancy 13 minutes off seemed small, but together they mapped it against the tidal charts. The risk was obvious. Draper's quiet nod showed she understood how a minor detail could spiral into operational failure. They worked through the report in tandem, Reyes guiding her through the process of verifying digital records against the physical paperwork, comparing signatures, and cross-referencing logs. Draper's notes grew more precise with each step. Reyes explained that vigilance meant more than following procedure. It meant understanding the consequences of what might seem like bureaucratic noise. She emphasized that reporting an anomaly wasn't just about compliance, but about protecting people who might never know their safety depended on a small act of attention. When Draper asked if they should go straight to security, Reyes paused. She unlocked her drawer and pulled out the anomaly form. We document first, then escalate, she said, splitting the observations into what belonged in the official record and what required a more careful, private log. Draper watched as Reyes described each irregularity with careful language, avoiding speculation, sticking to verifiable facts. She handed Draper a copy of the report, instructing her to keep it secure. The moment felt heavier than routine transfer of responsibility, a signal that Draper now played a role in the system's defense. As they left the office, Reyes accompanied Draper to the secure drop box. The private hesitated before submitting her report. "Will this actually change anything?" Her tone was uncertain, but Reyes answered plainly. "Change is slow, but every report makes it harder to ignore the pattern." Draper slid the envelope through the slot, her shoulders straightening as she did so. Back in her office, Reyes updated her anomaly matrix. Draper's report joined others: a supply sergeant in Bahrain, a drone operator in Okinawa, each small, isolated observation now part of a growing web. Reyes pinned the new data point on the board, the connections becoming clearer. The system, once indifferent, now showed signs of self-correction. The Karachi checks and the culture of reporting had taken root, and junior personnel no longer hesitated to bring forward concerns. The terminal chimed with a new message from Vartan, the subject line routine but the contents more telling: personnel evaluations, coded footers, and beneath the surface, the beginnings of a new operation in the Baltic. Reyes decrypted the details, flagged the relevant anomalies, and recommended the Karachi checks as part of pre-mission protocol. She sent her response without delay, knowing that the cycle of vigilance required constant reinforcement. Outside, the base lights glowed against the darkness. Inside, the anomaly matrix remained visible on her Walla map of vigilance, each pin a reminder that the fight against complacency was ongoing. Draper would be back, and others would follow, each learning that the process mattered as much as the outcome. The cycle continued, not just in the detection of threats, but in the quiet transfer of knowledge and the steady expansion of trust in the system. As the night deepened, Reyes turned off her monitor and sat in the hush of her office. The hum of the climate control and the faint click of her keyboard marked the rhythm of work that rarely ended. The next anomaly would come soon enough, and she would be ready. In the world Reyes inhabited, the struggle rarely made headlines. The unseen war played out far from any parade ground, in the quiet tension of offices where the cost of vigilance was measured in solitude and sleepless nights. The medal pressed beneath her collar was a private reminder, recognition for work that would never be spoken of outside classified briefings. She understood that the real fight was not against a single adversary, but against the slow creep of complacency, the errors that multiplied in silence, and the temptation to look away when something didn't add up. Most threats never arrived with a warning. They hid in the margins: an altered manifest, a maintenance log out of sequence, a signature that didn't match the roster. Reyes had learned to read these details, to spot patterns that others missed. The system, for all its protocols, depended on people willing to question what was handed to them. She thought of Draper quietly flagging a timing error, the supply sergeant in Bahrain who caught a duplicate order, and the analyst who noticed an unfamiliar login in the South China Sea drone logs. Each small act of attention formed a fragile net, stretched over a landscape of shifting risks. The work demanded a kind of discipline that never let up. She reviewed the flagged drone anomaly from the 80-twand, the report easy to miss among the hundreds that crossed her desk each week. The private who submitted it had a reputation for thoroughness and observation that, in another context, might have been dismissed as overzealous. Reyes pulled the service record, cross-referenced the anomaly with recent equipment transfers, and logged the case for further review. The process was methodical, built on habits formed by years of catching problems before they spiraled. She documented each step, knowing that sometimes the only proof of a threat was the persistence of the person who refused to ignore it. The cost of this vigilance was real. Trust, once a given, became a calculation. She remembered the fate of officers like Commander Everett removed from command, their reputations quietly erased, their sacrifices known only to a handful. It was a reminder that the most important victories often left no visible mark. The system needed its visible heroes, but it survived because of those who worked in the shadows, accepting that their greatest successes would remain unacknowledged. As Reyes closed out the day's files, she paused at the window. The base was quiet, the last of the training flights circling overhead, runway lights blinking in the dusk. She thought of the new protocols, the anomaly logs, the slow shift in culture as more junior officers brought their concerns forward. The system still had gaps, but it was learning, becoming less tolerant of silence, more attuned to the value of speaking up. The unseen war continued, not with banners or fanfare, but in the steady rhythm of reports filed, patterns checked, and questions asked when something felt wrong. Reyes gathered her things, feeling the weight of the unmarked medal as she moved through the empty corridor. The work ahead would be the same, quiet, relentless, and vital. In places no one would ever see, someone would always be watching, ready to notice what others miss. The conclusion to Reyes's story isn't found in medals or ceremonies. It unfolds in the quiet, routine late nights at a desk, careful checks of logs, and the steady discipline of those who catch what others overlook. History may highlight bold maneuvers, but security is built by those who notice the altered details and document what no one else will. These acts of vigilance, often invisible, change systems and save lives. Their victories lack parades, but keep battalions alive. Look closer at your post. If you know someone who works behind the scenes, share this story below and subscribe for more accounts of quiet courage.